Yeah, so I usually thank the organizers for the invitation, but I'm going to complain instead because I'd much rather actually be there in person than doing this virtually because I think I've never been to Vienna, right? So this does not count as a colloquium because I want to be invited in person just as soon as we, so there's some really important stuff that I ought to tell you, but I'm not going to tell you until you invite me back again. Okay. So yes, so I think what I'm supposed to talk about is tacos, as far as I can tell, right? That's which we're very familiar with here in California. So tacos are this great Mexican food. The best tacos are from New Mexico, really, rather than California or Texas, but people argue about that. And we see that they have lots of nice, interesting ingredients, none of which are great by themselves, but they make a very good combination. Okay, so the outline of today's talk is, first I'll talk a little bit about machine learning in physical sciences. I got involved in it about 10 years ago. And these days I teach a graduate course on the topic in general. So I'll give some very general background. Then I'll switch to machine learning in electronic structure. So it's had some impact over the last 10 years, and we'll see that it's appearing all over the place. And then finally, I'll end with machine learning to make new density functionals, which is what I have wasted my life on. Okay, this is my group here from a year or so ago. We never actually all meet anymore because of the virus. And the work I'll talk about is the machine learning work. So these are the people involved, and especially Upali Kalita is a chemistry graduate student who will be finished in another 6 months or so, and we'll be looking for a postdoc. Okay, so what is machine learning, right? It's just statistics and abundant computing resources. And our current version has developed over the last, say, 15 years, where these things have become very powerful. And when I say it's just these things, it still takes a lot to learn about it, and it's still being developed as we go along. So it's really just sets of algorithms for performing various tasks, and underlying them are sort of theories of statistical learning that help you sort of optimize the output of doing those tasks. And a lot of the stuff you need is available as Python notebooks, so pretty much anyone, anywhere can get into doing this machine learning. There's a near infinite amount of information on the web to teach yourself, but actually this is a problem now because these different sources don't necessarily agree on terminology and all sorts of things, and so it's hard to get a consistent picture, especially if your background is in physical sciences. Okay, so machine learning methods are, you need to start with data, and usually you have n vectors of length d, and the size of the vector is the number of features, and these days n can go up to, you know, tens of millions of data, hence big data. You need a cost function, something that is telling you how well you're doing your task, what it is you're trying to minimize. You need an optimizer, some way of finding the minimum. And then, of course, overall, you need a model. You have some model, some, you know, if we think of regression fitting a function, you need some model with parameters that you're going to fit. So here's this is a subset of machine learning tasks. There are many, many different ones. These are mostly, well, supervised learning is when you have labels on your data. So you know what the y value is given a set of x's. And then if you do it as a continuous function, it's regression, or if there's categories, most common being sort of 0 and 1 binary categories, then that's classification. So there are many different tasks, many different names, and most of it ends up being some kind of estimating a probability distribution. So underlying almost all these tasks is estimating probabilities from the data given. Okay, so machine learning and physical sciences. So in a sense, most of us tend to be frequentists because we're highly trained physical scientists. Most modern algorithms are Bayesian in their setup. You can interpret under various conditions. You can interpret things either in a Bayesian framework or frequentist, but usually things are derived one way or the other. A lot of the ideas of physical laws are counter to the Bayesian approach because a physical law is something you believe to be true always. And the Bayesian approach, in a sense, never allows that. There's always some possibility of error. And standard methods of machine learning often need to be modified when you want to apply them to physical problems, especially we'll see in sort of theoretical problems, because they're too general for they're designed for sort of very different circumstances. Okay, so image recognition is very well developed. So a lot of the successes of machine learning have been centered around image recognition, especially with the recent sort of neural networks. And so this has had a big impact on microscopy and on observational astronomy. And so part of that is the data comes as two-dimensional images. And if your problem is already set up that way, then you can basically take methods off the shelf and apply them, and usually things work pretty well straight out of the box. So the downsides of this sort of revolution in machine learning is, I would say that at least half the papers that come across my desk should never see the light of day, because the quality, there are various issues of quality control. There's lots of silly stuff, some bad stuff, and even some fraudulent stuff, but that doesn't mean that there isn't good stuff, right? So, but it does mean you have to be rather careful. Reproducibility is a huge issue. It is much more difficult to, even sort of at a basic level, it's difficult to include enough information so that people can truly reproduce your results. And computer science is a very different publishing culture than most of our physical sciences. People publish by getting into high quality conferences, and then there's a 4-page sort of abstract, and that's it for the process of publication very often. And that's very different from what we're used to, and peer review and so forth means something else. And basically, the field is evolving so fast. If you have an algorithm that does something better than previous algorithms, you sort of roughly describe it, you give some pseudocode, whatever. There might be a GitHub repository, but then others will recode, reuse your algorithm, and the marketplace will discover whether or not there's any if it's good. Okay, so that was machine learning in 10 minutes. And I have this course which I'm trying to figure out how to sort of make it available online so that lots of people can use it. But it's very interesting to see all the different applications of machine learning that people are doing. So I'm not going to give you a sort of broader view anymore. Now we'll focus on electronic structure. And one thing is, I should mention that I'm more or less going to assume that people are familiar with the basics of how DFT calculations go, because there isn't enough time to explain everything. Okay, So one of the big impacts that's really coming online about now is machine learning to design force fields. So if you're running DFT calculations, usually 500 or 1,000 atoms, it starts becoming very expensive. But if you're running classical MD, you can do 10 million atoms without too much effort. So what's been happening, and it started with the Baylor Parinello work, I think 2006, where they used a neural network to create a much more sophisticated and accurate force field, I think for silicon in that case. And then, so they run the DFT calculations. They may have a few thousand data points, different configurations of the silicon. They use that to learn a much more sophisticated force field than the simple models that people had before, and then they can run it in an MD simulation, bypassing the need to solve the Kohn-Sham equations at each point. So there's a bunch of people. Gabor Szanyi is another one who's been really developing this over the last 10 years. These are now very sophisticated, and for certain materials at least, they're available to run. And I call that configuration space because that's where you take a material, often one or two elements, and you learn the force field for that combination. And what you want to do is maybe a simulation with cracks and things like that in it. On the other hand, chemical compound space has been developed where these methods in which you include, say, up to a dozen different atoms, main group chemistry, and you want to explore all the molecular structures they can make. Another big use of machine learning has been these data repositories, Nomad in Germany, and the Materials Project here at Berkeley. And then there are lots and lots of different applications. People are trying things out all the time, like accelerating MD. And then here's a couple of reviews that I did with Anatole over the last few years. And there are many others already since then. Okay, so this is, getting classical forces by simply running on DFT and training to make the force fields. This is one more designed for medicinal chemistry, this ANI methodology, and now they don't just run it on DFT calculations. They also do couple cluster calculations, so more accurate quantum chemistry ones. They spend a lot of computer power running those calculations, but then they can train on them. See, 14 million CPU core hours to get, to get force fields for a few main group atoms and maybe one or two heavier ones. This is one from, I think, about a year ago. This was the Gordon Bell Prize winner, where a bunch of people at mostly at Princeton and Berkeley got together and ran. They claimed to be getting 100 million atoms with sort of DFT accuracy. So I think they did water molecules and they did copper. And the idea is they're sort of learning the force field on the fly. So it very cleverly updates the force field, but when it discovers some area where the forces are not so accurate. So again, I think a few thousand DFT calculations needed to train the force field well enough. And here's one. I don't know who these people are, but they're using this kind of methodology for phase transitions of zirconia. So again, these are applications in materials. Another one that I just happened to pick at random was here's a differentiable neural network force field. for ionic liquids, right? So here's a place where it could be really, really helpful. And notice this, we'll talk a little bit about this differentiable programming is becoming almost now the standard for sort of machine learning applications. So this is where you calculate the errors basically analytically, and you use this backpropagation algorithm to do it, and that way you can optimize very, very efficiently. What else is there here? Okay, yeah, this is how to do the how to sort of make the model of the atomic environment with these force fields, and studying what what are the best ways to do this. So again, with the idea of improving these potentials. So you see that this is really beginning to become almost, very much a standard thing that people do these days. And finally, I found a recent one of Anatol's, which we have. I think this is the Star Wars logo. I hope there isn't any copyright issue here. That's been used to explore chemical compound space. Okay, so this is lots of people. So one thing I would say, especially for students, I say this to my students, you're kind of crazy if you're a graduate student right now not to take at least sort of one course or learn a bit of machine learning, right? These days, it used to be that sort of half the students go to universities, the other half go to national labs. Now, the biggest chunk of them are vanishing into various parts of Google, as we'll see. Oh, and look, even Uli's been doing some machine learning here, right? With some old friends like Bjork Hammer. So yeah, so this is really cool because, so most of what I'll talk about are sort of theoretical applications, but here this is really neat where you can, surface problems, right? The figuring out what the actual surface is really important. These days, there are too many combinations, too many possibilities. So this was a sort of in-between use of the machine learning to more quickly search the possibilities for what this oxide stone would be. And then here's a very much more detailed one. This is kind of stuff I like to do. So this is clustering. This is unsupervised learning. And this is a very simple question that people developing DFT often look at, which is, well, you have this larger data set. Now this is for material, so it's not that large. It's only got 44, I think, but showing that the statistics of the data set can be represented by something like 7 out of the 44. And therefore you only need to sort of test and train your density functionals on the 7, and it'll give you representative numbers of the whole set. So this saves a lot of time. So all over the place, people are using these tools now. And so I just spent the last 3 weeks at the KITT in Santa Barbara. And a friend of mine was sort of saying, on math, we were discussing how, there's a lot of math progress also being made in understanding these algorithms. The only problem is many of the graduate students don't actually finish their PhDs anymore. They just vanish into the metaverse, I believe it's now called, right? Okay, so that was again a very quick survey of applications that are going on, but it's becoming almost a sort of a standard tool, and you can also see that stuff is being sort of developed very fast, and then certainly stuff that turns out to be useful is very highly cited very quickly. So all that's very exciting, and there are many things to do, but my interest has been in using it as a tool to find density functionals. So very briefly. So yeah, the focus of all my work, right? So we're not analyzing the output of DFT calculations, but rather see if we can make better functionals. What do we mean by a better density functional? Well, I usually think of it either it's more general, so something that applies to places that didn't apply before, or it could be more accurate, something that works in the places where our usual functionals work, but works a bit better, or it might be more efficient. It costs less to run. So two functionals that I'll talk about approximating. One is the non-interacting kinetic energy functional of a set of electrons. So that's what's evaluated when you solve the Kohn-Sham equations. That's the most important job that they're doing. And so there's a whole area called orbital-free DFT, where if you only had a good enough approximation for that guy, you wouldn't have to solve the Kohn-Sham equations. And so you could go much faster. And then the focus of modern DFT research, a big focus, is learning better formulas for the exchange correlation energy. That's the thing that people approximate in all the calculations that they do. And these days, by the way, there's at least 50,000 Kohn-Sham DFT calculations published each year. So while I'm talking, 10 more will have appeared. Okay. So we're trying to design new density functional approximations. And I think of two kinds of things you can do that people do in this area. So you can take the approximations that we currently have and try to make them better. Or a lot of my work has been involved in using the machine learning to find entirely new functional approximations that do things that we can't do right now. So the first problem we looked at, this was at a meeting of this institute, math institute at UCLA, and I ran into this character, Klaus Robert Mueller, a very nice guy. Some beer was consumed, some bets were made, and then a very good postdoc of his, Matthias Rupp, and a good student of mine, John Snyder, were at the institute for 3 months, and they hacked away at the problem. So this was simply, can you use machine learning to find this kinetic energy functional? And all we did was put particles in a box. We put different potentials at the bottom of the box. It's trivial, it's one dimension. It's trivial to do the quantum mechanics. And then given examples of densities and kinetic energies, could we learn the kinetic energy functional just for this situation? And we use something called kernel ridge regression, which I think of as a sort of small data method. But what's important is that the kernel that goes into this method, see here, this is a Gaussian kernel, but the argument in the Gaussian is this difference between two densities squared and integrated over the system. So this is a totally non-local density functional. It looks nothing like anything that anyone had done before. And you just have a linear combination of the kernel with your training data, and you want to evaluate it at some new unknown density. And we had some, within a few weeks, Matthias and John had already shown that with about 100 data points, you could get chemical accuracy for the, less than 1 kilocal per mole error at a 20th of an EV. And so you could reproduce energies, and then it turned out that the functional derivative, when you do it that way, turns out to be terrible. On the other hand, we found a way of projecting on in the directions in which we had data, and then you get much better functional derivatives, and then you can solve this problem, in a sense, self-consistently, and still get to chemical accuracy. So that was just a demo showing that you could use data to make the totally non-local functional that works very well for the systems that it's trained on. That's all we sort of achieved in that case. And that was 10 years ago, and that was interesting because it hadn't been done before. Fast forward now to 2017, this is a more sort of realistic example. So this is doing the first MD simulation, not with a force field, but with a kinetic energy functional that's been designed using the machine learning. And this is a simple molecule. We take malonaldehyde, we take 2,000 snapshots from DFT calculations. We train on that. It's basically the same idea as in that particle in a box problem with some important bells and whistles added. And what was nice is this proton transfers from one side to the other, and that wasn't in the training data. So all the forces are coming from this machine learned functional in that case. More recently, in the same collaboration, that was continued, but this is with Mihail Bogojeski, a recent graduate student of Klaus Robert Mueller's, and Leslie Vogt Moranto, she was on the other one. We redid this using couple cluster training instead of DFT training data in order to get higher accuracy. So this picture this is our first sort of illustration, right? This is the water molecule, and we found this fairly inaccurate density functional in the literature. You know, I'm not quite sure what it is. I think they call it PBE. And you see sort of around equilibrium for the water molecule, it's pretty accurate, but it turns out if you stretch or compress it quite a bit, you start to see substantial inaccuracies relative to high-level quantum chemistry. So what we did in this case was here's the training curve, so the number of training samples. So you plot these things as a function of the data, and you get, it converges to something with about a 2 kilocal per mole error, the error in the density functional. Then we do the same with a couple cluster data, and of course the error goes to 0. But what we figured, and various people had done versions of this before, of course, is that we do this delta learning where we learn the difference, the error made by our Crummy density functional, and it turns out it converges much, much faster. And the potential energy surfaces of the two are quite different, but the difference is very smooth. So you could learn the difference much, much faster than you learn either the approximate functional or the highly accurate stuff. So you use that then to correct, say, an MD simulation using your density functional, and you can turn it into MD with highly accurate quantum chemical data. So we set off a trajectory. This is resorcinol. This is the OH. It rotates, and we knew that our bad density functional gives you pretty bad rotational barriers. So we took us a while. We found some trajectories where this is the couple cluster trajectory, this is the PBE trajectory, totally different because it gets the rotational barrier wrong. And then we're testing various versions of our delta DFT, and it's highly accurate. So then we're able to do that. But these functionals that we're making here are mostly, they work sort of for the molecule that they've been trained on. They don't necessarily generalize. They do generalize a little bit, but not very well to other situations. So you have to sort of retrain for each molecule you look at. Okay. So what I want to get to in the last hour of my talk is the most recent stuff, which is actually about the exchange correlation energy. So those things that I've shown you there, where we were looking at the kinetic energy functional to avoid solving the Kohn-Sham equations. And there's sort of two reasons for that. One is that it'd be very nice to have this orbital-free DFT working, but also it gives us kind of as a training ground for thinking about exchange correlation, which is a more tricky problem. And in particular, a tricky part of exchange correlation is strong static correlation. So in condensed matter physics, many of the most interesting systems are strongly correlated, and our density functionals tend to fail for those systems. Even moderately correlated systems, they don't do so well on. So it would be nice to have a density functional that handles those things. And in chemistry, one aspect of that, at least, that you can mimic is if you take a bond and you stretch it, all of our standard density functionals, our semi-local, tend to fail as the bond gets very stretched. And we call that static correlation in chemistry, and that's at least one of the effects of strong correlation. Strong correlation really means electrons localizing on separate atoms. And that's, in fact, that's why we mix some fraction of exact exchange in global hybrid functionals. Okay, now interestingly, I'd forgotten this, but I remembered a few years ago, the first people to use a neural network to find exchange correlation was actually Nick Handy's group in, look at this, 1996. They were just a little too early, right? This was the first wave of neural nets, which sort of petered out because there wasn't enough computing power to really take advantage of them. And David Tozer and they designed a functional looking at the exchange correlation potential way back then. Okay, now this is the kind of problem we want to be able to solve, an H2 binding curve. We want to see if we can get the entire curve. This was a famous science perspective, just showing, your standard functionals, Hartree-Fock, P3-Lip, LDA, all, if you restrict the calculation as you stretch the H2 bond to being a spin singlet, then you get, it dissociates to the wrong energies. So the work I'm going to talk about was inspired by work from this very good graduate student at Tokyo and Osamu Sugino's group, Ryo Nagai. And what they did was they took just a few molecules, 3 or 4, and they trained not just on the energies, but also on the densities. They got highly accurate densities from couple cluster, and they trained approximate functionals, an LDA, a GGA, maybe one other hybrid. And what they showed was, if you use the density in the training, then you could generalize much better, and they would test it on 150 molecules, and they would get results that were, so let's say, comparable to, sometimes better than, the human designed functionals. So this is in this regime of taking approximate functionals and trying to make them better. But what was surprising is how well it generalized. So they only needed a few examples to get that working. So there were some limitations to what they did. So as I said, they were just using semi-local approximations, and then often in chemistry, just testing at equilibrium bond lengths. They didn't have differential programming, so it was very expensive for them to go downhill, trying to optimize. They got these really good results. So somehow the density was helping. Okay, so now what I'm going to show you, we use this 1D electronic structure lab that we developed here at Irvine over the last decade or so. So this is in order to make progress kind of quickly and test ideas quickly for strongly correlated things. We use DMRG to solve 1D problems. It's pretty much the world's best quantum solver for 1D. Mostly the people in that field do model Hamiltonians. They're interested in strongly correlated physics. And Steve White is a friend of mine, and he invented it originally. So what Steve and I did over a few years was our groups figured out how to sort of apply DMRG to this sort of one-dimensional mimic of real electronic structure. And what's great is you can press the buttons on the DMRG and it produces answers very, very fast. So you can get lots of incredibly accurate data, more accurate than the quantum chemical methods. And this is one of our early things where we just illustrate the Mott-Hubbard gap. We take a 1D chain of hydrogen atoms, and we space them apart. And now it's always a Kohn-Sham metal, because it's always a half-fill band, so the gap goes to 0, but the true gap is about 10 EV in this case. Okay, so we use that in general to test out ideas for strong correlation DFT. And here's this. This is exactly the analog of H2 in this one-dimensional world, but you see that it's behaving in exactly the same kind of way. This is restricted Hartree Fock, and then if you allow it to break symmetry, it dissociates to the right values. And so this is all very analogous to what happens in the real world. Okay. So lots of people have been trying to make better functionals. And here are examples from the literature. But a lot of the time they focus on exchange correlation potentials, for example. Can they learn exchange correlation potentials, which is actually a much harder thing to do in some ways than learning the energy, and it's actually the energy that we want, right? So if you think about it, the ground state energy is really what people extract from DFT calculations. Most energy errors are dominated by the error in the approximate functional, not in the density. And this map between densities and potentials is very tricky. So we don't try to approximate the potentials at all. And most we use the densities. So why the density? In fact, people sort of don't realize that you can get all, it gives you all the derivatives of the energy with respect to the one body potential. And so, for example, it has all the forces and the polarizabilities and so forth. And by using the density, you don't even have to look at the potential. Okay, so this work was, I noticed that it came out about almost exactly a year ago. So this is the Kohn-Sham regularizer. So this was an idea of Lee here, who had been a student of mine and then went off to Google Accelerated Science. And they were interested in these DFT problems. So this gang here are all from Google. And then myself and a very good graduate student, Brian Pedersen, worked on this. And what we do is, so this was sort of the highlight of the paper. We have our data set of these H2 binding curves, and we take just 2 points, 2 training points. So these are these diamonds here. And we say, we're just going to take data from those 2 points, and we'll have 1 validation point in between. We'll just validate on the energy, I think. And so we make different functionals inside our neural net. So this Kohn-Sham regularizer, this is a local approximation, a GGA, and then global means using the entire density. This uses the density at a point and neighboring points. This just uses it at each point. And what we say is we want to make a functional using just the density and the energies at these points. And can we get the entire binding energy curve right? And you can see at the end here that we do to within 1 kilocal per mole. This is in Hartree's with a global functional. So how do we do that? So it uses just 2 training points. One of them is near equilibrium, and then the other one is when it's stretched, so as to capture the physics of equilibrium stuff and to capture the strongly correlated physics. So what it does is it actually uses the Kohn-Sham iterations itself. So a crucial part was the differential programming, because this thing has to be very, very efficient. And what it's doing is looking at the errors in the energy and also in the density. It looks at the Kohn-Sham iterations, and because it has all this data of the relationship between density and energy, it keeps updating the functional. And it's, you can see here that so as it goes through, it's changing what the functional is, doing a better and better job. I think maybe on the next one, we'll see, here we go, and you see it's beginning to find the right binding energy curve. Now we need also a validation point, because we have to be able to stop it, or else it will overfit the density and give you a bad result. Okay, and so this is a way of representing these densities, and so what it does is it sort of at t equals 0 at the start, it has a very bad functional, and you do a bunch of Kohn-Sham calculations, but then it learns from that, and then here it does a much better one. Now here's the exact density in this representation at a stretched configuration, and you see this blue one here is sort of the one that doesn't overfit. This is the first one, and it's pretty bad. Then the blue one gets you, looks like the exact density, but if you keep going, this purple one is even much more accurate, but the trouble is you've now sort of overfit the density, and in fact you'll get bad energies. So we need a validation point to be able to pick out the place where we're just right. Just right. Okay. So that's nice. We can get the entire binding curve for H2 that way with sort of chemical accuracy, but you can do the same thing for H4, training on a couple of separations of H4, and then we can build in self-interaction error, no problem. So it gets H2 plus right, but then finally here we have two H2s, and we didn't train on that at all. We trained on the H4 and the H2 separately, and it gives you not quite chemical accuracy for a pair of H2s coming together. So this is sort of generalizing pretty well for this kind of thing. Now we can skip all this stuff. Okay, so, and then future directions. So this came out, and there's been a lot of interest in doing this, generalizing to spin DFT, test many different variations and flavors. Does it work for weak correlation? And does it work for asymmetric cases? So actually this was future directions about 6 months ago. And then just about a month ago, there's this Europe's workshop on differential programming, and we had done a bunch of work for weakly correlated systems and found that it works extremely well. Again, with our 1D, in our 1D world. So in the weakly correlated systems, we just trained on a few atoms and validated on one particular ion, and then tested on molecules, and we find that we get very good, let's skip that. Actually, the potentials are not bad, but the densities are all very good when we do it this way. And that one will go on. There's a version on the web already that was part of the conference, but we have a more scientifically written paper that we're just finishing. As the original version was for differential programming people. Okay, so my summary is, so we have these new methods for creating new functionals. Sorry, I have to do something with my screen here so I can see it. So that correctly dissociate. For us, this key trick was regularizing using the Kohn-Sham iterations, which stops it sort of going off and doing something sort of crazy. It seems to generalize much better, just like Rio had found. This is an old slide. I'll show you this in a minute. And these are my collaborators, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so let me just say one last thing. So there was this recent Science article. Oh, so that came out just about less than a month ago, I think, from DeepMind, which is a separate branch of Google. And they created a new density functional. Well, let's say they took an approximate method that had never been able to work before in the literature, And in particular, so this is a methodology for molecular systems only at the moment, but you can see here they trained on dissociation curves, and in fact they can even do, it doesn't show it here, N2, which is amazing that they can dissociate a nitrogen bond and they get the binding energy curve. Oh, there it is. They're working rather well. And what they've done is they've used ideas of fractional charge in order to do the training to get these dissociation curves right. So they're taking an approximate form. Well, let me see here. So it's very high quality stuff. So it's a different strategy. It uses this approximate form that has been too complex for people to get right. They did not use accurate densities, but they needed more data. So they use a lot of data in order to train it. From the stuff in the paper, I can't actually follow how the dissociation curves were calculated, but Aaron Cohen is one of the co-authors, and you may recall he's his name is on that Science article from 13 years ago, and this uses lots of the ideas that I've showed you, my work and lots of other people's work, in order to get this thing to work. And actually, they have no pictures of the functionals, so I'm actually talking to them about it to find out more about how that works. Okay, so with that, I think I'll stop with the presentation. Thank you all for listening, and see if we have any questions.